Esteemed colleagues and honored guests, I will open by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I am recording this presentation. They are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which is land now known as Melbourne in Australia. I also acknowledge their elders past and present. People living in Australia acknowledge country when we hold a meeting here to show and raise awareness of the long history of Aboriginal peoples on this land. In our case, it reminds us to approach the practice of translation and interpretation as one that allows traditionally disempowered people to reclaim and define their sovereignty. The same goes for the Korean language and its dialects, where defining our sovereignty looks like uncovering and rejecting colonial terms. For example, we prefer one of our favorite foods to be called omuk over odeng, and we are increasingly reverting to the gender-neutral third-person singular pronoun 그 over the gendered pronouns 그 and 그녀 that were imposed on us during colonial rule. We have had free movement across the peninsula for thousands of years and under different dynasties and nations, and we've only been divided for the past 70 years. This period is short compared to the length of our shared history, but it has given the dialects of North and South Korea unparalleled opportunities for evolution, given the pace of technological development and interactions with other countries and languages. The dialects that have evolved in the North and South today, therefore, bear distinct socio-political marks. South Korea is geographically small but has distinct accents and words across regions. Dialects are mostly mutually intelligible. The national standard is the dialect of the capital, which is the dialect taught in schools. It has developed consistently with rapid industrialization and the wealth that has followed. Now we use a lot of words taken or derived from English, like computer or handphone. Social media has increased the rate of abbreviation and text speak to match the fast pace of life, the 빨리빨리 culture of a technologically advanced society. North Korean dialects I personally know less about, but it would be reasonable to assume that the usual principles apply about the influence of Russian, Chinese, and Japanese on common words, and the difference between language as used by the state and language as used by the people. The best known difference between North and South Korean is the replacement of one consonant for another. So you can see on the slide, 여행 or 려행 in North Korean, 연로자 in South Korean, 연로자 in North Korean, and 노동 and 노동. Translation and interpretation practice is highly advanced in relation to the South Korean dialect, in part because of the waves of refugees and economic migrants to other countries. In other words, there was demand for it. Machine translation is also well advanced between Korean and English, although my partner Siri is much better at translating his English into Korean than my Korean into English. North Korean is a little bit more of a challenge because of its relative isolation. Putting aside sanctions and human rights concerns just for the moment, there are few opportunities to collaborate with North Korean linguists in a common language and few opportunities to analyze and understand the range of language and literature in North Korea. So when we come to official documents like law, understanding the legal architecture and philosophy will help governments and corporations alike to understand the motivations of a government beyond easy stereotypes. It helps us make sense of legislative intention, principles of statutory interpretation, and political and financial motivations. The impact of the global pandemic in my city of Melbourne was that we had 2 very strict lockdowns and we weren't allowed to go outside for a very long time. At this time, I had just started working as a barrister. This is a specialized type of lawyer who must operate a sole practice to preserve the ethical duty of independence. So the timing of the lockdown meant that I had no work as a barrister for several months and I got very bored. Most people in my position were perfectly happy to whip up some dalgona coffee, and instead I decided to add to my own workload by starting to write under my own name rather than as part of an organization. I chose the topic of North Korean law because it was an underserved area, and I realized that North Korean laws are not widely available in English. There were maybe a dozen translations from different organizations. Some were machine translated not very well, and others were outdated because of legislative amendments since that translation. My other finding in this scoping review of resources was that when I looked up North Korean law, most of what I found on Google were unverified and sensationalist lists of 10 things that are illegal in North Korea or 10 weirdest laws in North Korea. Whatever one's politics, it is important to approach a legislative corpus soberly in acknowledgement of what that content can tell us about how a government thinks and what it values. There are moments in life when an idea strikes you out of the blue and you realize you are one of very few people who can bring it to life. For me, it was this project. I grew up bilingual as a Korean in New Zealand and then in Australia. As a child, my mother made me translate English picture books into Korean during the summer holidays. I also spoke Korean at home for as long as I lived with my family, and then I did a double degree in law and arts where I majored in French and minored in Mandarin Chinese. I trained at university in some basic translations, and I now practice as a lawyer, specifically as a barrister who specializes in in-court advocacy, and I'm almost finished with my PhD thesis. Since 2015, I have also been a consultant with the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, where my working languages are North and South Korean, English, and occasionally French. So after all of this, what does this tell us about what I can do? There are few people who are legally qualified and are competent at reading and understanding North Korean, South Korean, and English. Neither does anyone have infinite time and technological skills to put together a partly automated online resource and see the legal, academic, and commercial value of having one single source of North Korean laws in English. To conclude, I'm not a certified translator, but I knew it was possible to build a credible and quality resource that could later be improved on. Law in North Korea was born from an identified need to demystify today's iteration of the Hermit Kingdom. It aims to translate all available laws of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea into English. My hope is that it will contribute to the study of North Korea in the Anglophone world, which has a relative vacuum of impartial and systematic resources. This impoverishes several fields of knowledge and contributes to racist depictions of a whole people on the basis that we in the English-speaking world do not understand what they do and why they do it. The better we can do that, the more effective we will be at both engagement and accountability. The method is straightforward, and for transparency purposes, it is available on the website. The South Korean government makes available the legislation on its Unification Legislation Database, which is a joint effort of the Ministry of Reunification, Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Government Legislation. This database records 239 pieces of legislation between 1 and 46 PDF pages with an average of 7.25 pages. It is updated once a week, usually to correct small errors rather than to report on a legislative amendment. The database divides these laws into 20 categories that you can see on the slide, and it lists how many views each law has had, which are used as an indicator of interest in that specific law. The order of translation is therefore according to page view, i.e. popularity, as at the time I started in April 2020. I had as a guide the DPRK government's own official English translation of the 2014 Constitution to get a sense of the tone of the writing and the government's preferred English terms for keywords. I was also assisted by a translation of the criminal law prepared in 2009 by the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights. These were the first two laws I translated and updated according to their current amendments, which became the foundation of every translation that has followed. I was not able to find any online North Korean to English dictionary and no machine translation tool that understood North Korean. So for further translations, I mainly used Naver Dictionary and Google. The occasional term was challenging because there was no direct Korean to English translation. And for these challenging terms, I used a range of the following methods. First, the Korean section of the Naver Dictionary has a lot of North Korean terms. So I would search the term there to understand the meaning and then look through English language glossaries in that lexical field to find the closest term. I would then Google search that term to make sure it was the right one or as close as possible. When the Korean section did not list the term, I would put the term into Google using different spelling combinations or by breaking the term apart to see if I could find the South Korean equivalent of the term or parts of the term. At this stage, sometimes the North or South Korean term would show up in a Korean language glossary, so I would Google search the definition in English to see what term returned. If none of these methods worked, I ran the term through all the major languages supported by the Naver Dictionary, which are Japanese, Chinese, French, and Spanish. I studied all these languages to different degrees of fluency in my undergraduate degree, so it was easier to pick up linguistic cues in that third language. Chinese was especially helpful because many Korean words have their own hanja or sinographs, which means that when a term cannot be recognized in South Korean or English, it could be translated by referring to the hanja. Each law covers a specific topic with its own lexical field, so excluding a clearly wrong translation was easy, and then possible translations could be cross-checked across languages. Progress has been steady. Out of 239 laws, I have finished translating 80, so that's 1/3 of all the laws in the Unification Legislation database. There may be more that I'm not aware of. There are now almost 11,500 terms in the glossary, and it is constantly being updated as new terms are identified with each translation. I am the sole translator because I wanted every law to go through one brain so that the style and, more importantly, any errors would be consistent. So despite my best efforts, which you've now heard a lot about, any substantive errors are truly my own. I had the help of a couple of interns and my partner to set up the website and Google Drive folders. My brother and I also developed a very simple Excel tool to automatically find and replace terms so that a large and increasing part of the translation is automated, specifically the terms in the glossary. At this point, my main role is to rearrange the terms in grammatical order and occasionally finding a term that has come up for the first time. Law in North Korea has done two historic things to my knowledge. It has the first North Korean English glossary available online, and it is the first translation of North Korean laws processed through an extensive glossary with a consistent approach. It aims to be transparent and accountable, given that I'm not a professional translator, thus making it easier to release improved versions if errors can easily be identified and traced. I am hopeful that this project will enrich the study of North Korea in a range of fields. Law in North Korea has already been cited in at least one article, and I have been approached about citations in papers under preparation. There is potential for application in the fields of comparative laws, conflict of laws, business and trade, and politics and international affairs. This prompts questions like, what can this body of law tell us about the North Korean government's motivations and principles? Do they shed more light on how the government approaches domestic and international affairs? In what ways do they confirm or contradict what we already know? Returning to my human rights roots, these translations have already gone to the Human Rights Committee for the Universal Periodic Review process for North Korea. In its own submission, the government claimed to have improved access to rights for North Korean citizens and cited a list of legislation it had enacted but did not provide the text. As part of the submission of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, we attached what translations I had already completed as an appendix for the reference of the Human Rights Committee. This submission assisted the Human Rights Committee in formulating the list of issues on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. There may also be implications about whether the approach of the international community could be refined in relation to providing humanitarian aid or improving enforcement of sanctions. Law in North Korea is another resource for the Anglophone world to assist in how the two Koreas can approach reunification. We are learning from many other examples that it is not possible to move on peacefully from intergenerational trauma and division without accountability, reparations, and memorialization. Where it is possible to identify or corroborate systemic discrimination and persecution in these translations, there will be greater potential for collaboration with the English-speaking world about how it should be addressed to the satisfaction of the victims. Finally, if the availability of translated laws assists in demystifying North Korea and increases access to information about it, it will hopefully be of use to journalists and students who wish to report in a more accurate and informed way on subjects concerning North Korea. As I have foreshadowed, Law in North Korea is a pilot project run by one person part-time, so there is plenty of potential for quality assurance and several areas for expansion. It would be good to work with a certified translator who is familiar with both the North Korean dialect and with law, who could do a spot audit and suggest improvements to the method. It would be beneficial to build a more intelligent tool that could learn the vocabulary and the grammar to make it even easier to translate laws and other official documents from North Korean into English. It would be favorable to cross-check with an expert on North Korean and other Soviet satellite country politics about whether the translations accurately reflect the ideology and motivations of this group of countries. These nuances in word choice or grammar can influence statutory construction and therefore the legal and non-legal advice that can be given. And finally, it would be rewarding to get this resource to a level where we can analyze North Korean legislation in English to the same standard that is already being done in Korean, such as in the publications of the Korea Legal Research Institute. I humbly suggest that further development can only enrich the good work that is already being done in both English and Korean to make sense of North Korea and its position relative to other countries and to the international community. To conclude, there is a lot of work to be done to fully embrace the potential of translation and interpretation in relation to North Korea. And law in North Korea is one such product. Thank you to my new colleagues for welcoming this stranger into your midst, and I hope to work with you on the discipline of translation and interpretation in the future. Thank you also to the organizers for arranging such an important discussion at a moment when technological supports for translation and interpretation are becoming more and more viable. Enjoy the rest of this forum.